The Gettysburg Gospel, The Lincoln Speech That Nobody Knows, by Gabor Boritt. Narrated by Michael Kramer. Copyright 2006 by Gabor Boritt. This audiobook is published by arrangement with Gabor Boritt and the Elizabeth Kaplan Literary Agency and was produced in the year 2006 by Tantor Media, Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. Preface. The meaning of the Gettysburg Address has changed generation after generation. It has become one of the nation's most revered texts, even as historians and public figures have used it and puzzled over its meaning. Connotations given to it have twisted and turned. That Lincoln could not have meant all the things attributed to him over the years is clear, nor could the various versions of how he created his great speech all be true. Today, the image of the Gettysburg Address still swings between two extremes. At one end is a persistent tradition that goes back to 1863. It tells of a speech written on the train to Pennsylvania on a piece of wrapping paper retrieved from the floor. Then at the National Cemetery, people received the speech in silence. It had failed utterly, and the president knew it. Ward Hill Lamon, Lincoln's friend and biographer, and Marshal of the District of Columbia, gave the strongest voice to this tradition. A tale of genius and an uncomprehending public. Many believed what Lamon said. After all, he was at Gettysburg and served as the marshal of the dedication ceremonies. He had introduced the president before he spoke. If anyone knew, he did. The eldest son of the president, who had little use for Lamon, certainly credited him at one time. "My father's Gettysburg Address," Robert Lincoln wrote in 1885, "was jotted down in pencil, in part at least, on his way to the place." The Alabama-born writer Mary Shipman Andrews gave the story its great currency. One day her son Paul's history teacher, one Walter Burlingame, reminisced in class about his own youth. He told about hearing Edward Everett tell his father, diplomat Anson Burlingame, who also knew Lincoln, that the president wrote his address on a piece of brown paper on the train going up to Gettysburg. Everett, too, had to have known. He gave the main oration at Gettysburg. Young Paul Andrews went home and told his mother, who then wrote a captivating little book, The Perfect Tribute. An interesting provenance, this. Edward Everett tells Anson Burlingame something that is overheard by Walter Burlingame, who tells Paul Andrews, who tells Mary Shipman Andrews, who tells the world. Americans learned this history by heart. For long, The Perfect Tribute reigned as the most popular book on the subject, indeed perhaps on any Lincoln subject. Though Andrews's name is now mostly forgotten, the ideas she popularized still sway no small part of the general public. She admitted in private to taking one liberty in telling the tale. She turned the reputed silence of the Gettysburg crowd into vast reverence. The Perfect Tribute. The little book continues to go through endless editions. Project Gutenberg makes it freely available on the web, and it has been filmed at least twice in 1937 and 1991. That, then, is one end of the Gettysburg Address spectrum. At the other end looms the learned analysis of an extraordinary man of letters, Garry Wills, Lincoln at Gettysburg, The Words That Remade America. If Andrews's speech was written in a few minutes on the train and received with silence at Gettysburg, Wills's was prepared with care and stealthily remade America. If the broad public, the millions who make the pilgrimage to Gettysburg year after year, still hold with Andrews, a good part of the reading public has moved to Wills and made his book a bestseller, also the winner of the Pulitzer Prize. Admiring scholars have taken his ideas further. It is not surprising that the fiction writer, the artist Andrews, for whom a moment of inspiration is all important, sees Lincoln creating his speech in a flash of insight. And the scholarly writer Wills sees Lincoln laboring long and with care. It takes a heroic effort for the students of Lincoln to separate themselves from their subjects. Most of us fail to a smaller or larger degree. Between the two ends of the spectrum, the Gettysburg Address suffers no neglect from writers of history. Yet perhaps since they collected every scrap of the often confusing and contradictory information, and surely there will be more, it has been all too easy to get lost in the tangle. David C. Mearns, one-time chief of the manuscript division at the Library of Congress, a careful student of Lincoln, considered the many dubious recollections about the speech in an essay entitled Unknown at This Address. He then recommended that historians with cleared minds and jaundiced eyes begin again from scratch. This work attempts exactly that. In the process, it grew clear, to cite Mearns again, that some things were just transparently truthful. Some were not. And so a new story emerged. This book tries to clear away the range of meanings later generations laid upon the Gettysburg Address. Kent Graham, author of wonderful prose poetry about the president, wrote that, "If we Americans can't find Lincoln, we are lost." Graham described the address as a transaction between the dead and the living, between the past and the future, from which the speaker has disappeared. These words fit the study of the address itself. The chief purpose of the present work is to let 21st century readers find the speaker and his audience as they were in 1863. The story begins with a picture of Gettysburg after the battle, the site of the greatest man-made disaster in American history. This is where the president came to explain why a bloody war had to go on. These chapters give voice to the dissonance, confusion, and disruption of all that was normal for this town. A glance back at peacetime Gettysburg, in its moments of happiness, is included for contrast. But the book attempts a little more. Gospel suggests spiritual rebirth. When Lincoln's words are best understood, they bring that potential to Americans, indeed to people everywhere. The novelist John Steinbeck recounted his visit with his son to the Lincoln Memorial, and the awed young man blurting out, "Oh, Lord, we had better be great." The final chapter considers how Lincoln's speech rose to be American gospel, the good news, for it was not that at birth. That, too, is quite a story. Gettysburg, July 4th, 1863. Dreadful silence. It rains. People crawl out of their cellars, blinking in the gloomy light, trying to find their neighbors, food, news, life. Strange, awful odors overpower the air and seem to be growing, trying to imprison all in unbearable stench. Dead bodies are scattered over the streets, dead horses and mules. When the oppressive hush breaks, the clatter comes not from rifles or cannon fired to salute Independence Day, but in dead earnest by enemy armies still facing each other at the edge of the town. No toasts are offered today, no fireworks, no parades, no services in churches that are filling up with grievously wounded men. Gettysburg, July 4th, 1863. But Sally Myers, 23, full of life, forges ahead. The sun comes out, and in a free moment she'll write in her diary, "I never spent a happier 4th. It seemed so bright." The Union had retaken the town. A soldier will later add, "The glorious 4th, and we are still a nation, and shall most likely continue to be for centuries to come." Professor Michael Jacobs comes out of his house on Middle Street with his son Henry. So do others. A band marches down Baltimore Street, fife and drum breaking the noxious grip of stillness. People move toward the square. Gabor Boritt, Farm by the Ford, Gettysburg. Chapter 1. After Battle. Gettysburg, July 4th, 1863. Stench fills the air. Excrement from perhaps 180,000 men and more than 70,000 horses has been left behind in the area. There are thousands of flies, millions. Dead men barely covered in shallow graves. 7,000 dead men? More likely close to 10,000. How many dead horses and mules? 3,000? 5? None buried. A nurse writes of carcasses steaming in the sun. The smell of putrid animal flesh mingles with the odor of human decay. It extends into the spirit of the people. War had come to them. Then it had gone and left the horror behind. Gettysburg was, a modern progressive small town, though with nearly 2,400 souls as the war started, the census counted it as a city. The houses were brick mostly, spacious fenced yards behind each, with a vegetable garden, perhaps chickens, a cow, a shed, and the privy. The town took pride in its college, the Lutheran seminary, and all the benefits educational institutions bestowed. It had 3 weekly newspapers, 1 Democratic, the Compiler, and 2 Republicans, the Adams Sentinel and the Star and Banner. They were all highly partisan, but then so were most newspapers throughout the United States. During elections, the area tended to divide evenly between the 2 parties. Politics provided one of the most important and, at times, all-absorbing cultural activities. Religion provided the other. Gettysburg had 8 churches with 9 congregations, with Lutherans and Presbyterians predominating. It had a new rural burial ground on Cemetery Hill. The schools were public. Pennsylvania required public education, and as one would expect in a college town, Gettysburg had good schools, including 2 private ones for girls and many private instructors. The town had gaslight and some paved sidewalks, but its streets were alternately dusty or muddy. The seat of government for Adams County, it had a beautiful new courthouse built in 1859 close to the central square, the Diamond as the locals called it. It had new warehouses around a railroad station, also newly built in 1859, right after that modern mode of transportation had arrived in town. Gettysburg was on the move, with lawyers, doctors, merchants, bankers, blacksmiths, and various craftsmen serving the surrounding countryside of small farmers. It had hotels, taverns, and the county prison. Carriage manufacturing thrived with more than 10 shops. There were tanneries, 22 people made shoes and boots. Indeed, half of the population worked as artisans, a quarter as professionals, a quarter as unskilled laborers. The ethnic stock was Scotch-Irish and German, but everyone else also seemed to be represented, including new immigrants, who made up nearly 7% of the town's population. Black people, mostly the poorest part of the community, numbered 190, about 8% of the population. There were professionals and craftsmen among them, and even for the poorest, hope often lived. 1/3 of the black people had escaped from slave states, and freedom meant everything. Basil Biggs, for example, moved his family from Maryland to Gettysburg in 1858 so that his 7 children would have educational opportunities, and rented a farm from one of the most prominent members of the community. Biggs farmed and worked as a veterinarian. He must have been very good with animals, and by the end of the war would own his own farm right on Cemetery Ridge, including the copse of trees toward which Robert E. Lee had sent his doomed soldiers on July 3rd. Gettysburg was a modern town, a place of hope for many. But soon the battle came, and for a time making coffins would become an important occupation. So would ferrying bereaved visitors to one of the many makeshift hospitals or the battlefield and digging up the dead. Gettysburg had been transformed into a blighted land and needed to recover in body and soul. July 4th, 1863. The rebels are still on the outskirts, but the town is free. Blue-clad troops march in, their bands playing in an attempt to divert soldier and civilian from the horror. It is Independence Day, after all, and the armies are leaving. Life can begin again. But the wounded and dead remain, on the fields, in houses, in barns, and in hospital tents. 21,000 wounded, 10,000 dead. Disinfecting chloride of lime spread over the muddy streets turns them white for a little while and adds to the odors. Snow in July. The townspeople try to extinguish as far as possible the sense of smelling, one woman writes. They try to control disease. They pour kerosene on the bodies of horses and mules, light the fire over them, let them go up in smoke. The smell of burning flesh dissipates after a while. The smell of rotting carcasses will stay around for months. If a carcass is too close to a building or a good tree, it cannot be burned. It must rot. Many days are stiflingly hot, even the nights. To keep the stench out, most people don't open their windows. It is hard to keep the stench from their spirits. Rumors fly. The civilians are dying too. Sarah Broadhead, a wife, mother, and now nurse to the wounded of the battle, writes in a diary about her fears that we shall be visited with pestilence. Yet among the town's population there is no increase of disease and death. A resilient people. When strangers approach the town, the odors of the battlefield attack them long before they get there. But the visitors come, many to help, some to gawk, some to plunder, most looking for their lost loved ones from the armies. Masses of strangers. where to put them all. On July 9th, the New York Times reports no accommodations or food here for visitors, and last night many were compelled to roost in the barns or upon the steps of dwellings. A man feels lucky when he gets a chair to sit through the night in front of a hotel, better than wandering till daybreak. On July 13th, the Broadheads' house, in addition to a family of 3, has 3 wounded soldiers and 20 visitors. The strangers are filling every bed and covering the floors. Some complain about the visitors. Too much idle curiosity. Professor Michael Jacobs of the college, however, sees it differently. He wishes the whole land had come. Seeing the blood-stained fields, the sacrifice of the mangled soldiers, and the newly dug graves would rekindle people's patriotism and their gratitude to God for a most signal deliverance at Gettysburg. Many do come and stay in uncomfortable quarters, but their problems shrink in face of the immeasurable suffering of the wounded and the dying. Private George R. Freisinger arrives with an emergency militia unit sent to help maintain order. "We had a severe trial for young soldiers," he writes home to his father. His unit had limped into town on blistered feet and got placed in a church. The sacred structure reminded him of his home, which now felt like a distant Jerusalem to the ancient Jews. "So here we are quartered in a building which it was little thought at the day of its dedication would ever be used to serve the purposes of war. I see the pews occupied by forms moving amid the din and clanging of arms, which the soldiers are brightening up for duty, and instead of singers on the gallery, boys writing letters to their friends far away. Everything remains in the church seemingly just as the congregation left their last Sabbath's service. Hymn books are scattered through the pews, spittoons and footstools remain in the aisles, and the altar and pulpit carpeted with Brussels. Even the clock hangs suspended, ticking the hours as they fly, and which, instead of meeting the minister's eye, now catches the eye of the sergeant of the guard as he says, 'Fall in, second relief.' Perhaps we will not deface it much, this church," Freisinger writes to his father, adding, "Gettysburg cannot be called a town, but a large collection of hospitals." Eliza Farnham, a volunteer nurse from Philadelphia, tells much the same story. "The whole town is one vast hospital. The road for long distances is in many places strewn with dead horses. The earth in the roads and fields is plowed to a mire by the army wheels and horses, avenues of white tents. But good God, what those quiet-looking tents contained! What spectacles awaited us on the rolling hills around us! It is absolutely inconceivable. Dead and dying and wounded, torn to pieces in every way. Moans, shrieks, weeping, and prayer fill the houses, the barns, the tents, the fields and woods, the whole area. The land itself seems to wail. Nothing but suffering. Sights, sounds, smells unbearable. Horror. The piles of limbs dripping blood, the dying, the dead, hell on earth." Newspapers that seem loath to report on the horrors admit that the area is one vast hospital. Red and some green flags sprout everywhere identifying places housing the wounded. Nothing like this has ever happened in the United States. Looking back in September 1863, the U.S. Christian Commission would report a scene of horror and desolation which humanity, in all the centuries of its history, has seldom witnessed. The more measured tones of an Army medical officer's report would still be blunt. The period of 10 days following the Battle of Gettysburg was the occasion of the greatest amount of human suffering known in this nation since its birth, and the government was utterly unprepared for the greatest man-made disaster of American history. Jonathan Letterman, the medical director of the Army of the Potomac, had developed a remarkable system of caring for the wounded, but it was crippled by the commanding generals, first by Fighting Joe Hooker, who, chasing after Lee as he invaded Pennsylvania, did not wish to be encumbered by substantial amounts of medical supplies. This left no system at all, as Letterman would write in an official report that tried to minimize the disaster. Then Hooker's successor, George Gordon Meade, timidly kept much of what remained out of the possible reach of the Confederates, and so also of his own army. This Letterman would liken to engaging in battle without ammunition. Even as the fighting went on, the war-hardened nurse Ellen Orbison Harris of the Philadelphia Ladies' Aid Society understood what was happening. An evident reluctance to forward hospital stores to Hanover or Gettysburg, where a conflict supposed to rage, betokens a want of confidence in the position or strength of our forces. Can it be that our soil is to be crimsoned with the blood of our bravest and best? Crimsoned it was, and Dr. Letterman, who obeyed orders, would later write with anger, "Lost supplies can be replenished, but lives lost are gone forever." The U.S. Sanitary Commission, USSC, organized to provide civilian support for the military, sent 2 supply wagons to Gettysburg on July 4th. One was captured, its personnel sent to prison in Richmond. It would have been impossible to cope fully even without the bumbling of generals. The able Letterman himself went along when, with victory in hand, Meade followed the retreating Lee and, expecting another major battle, took with him most of the medical corps. "It was absolutely necessary that I should carry away the greater portion of my surgeons and medical supplies," Meade would explain. Close to 21,000 wounded Union and Confederate soldiers remained behind in Gettysburg. "What? Take away surgeons here where 100 are wanted?" exclaimed Andrew Cross, speaking for the U.S. Christian Commission, which focused on both the spiritual and physical needs of the men. But so it is. Even the angry commissioners vastly understated the problem, reporting that there was no more than 1 for 10 of the surgeons needed. In fact, out of the 106 medical officers left behind, perhaps 35 could actually operate. A distraught Ohio Army doctor and ordained minister, Harry Maccabee, who stayed back and had to care with 3 assistants for 1,000 badly wounded men, would resign with bitter words when the crisis passed. "It is my deliberate opinion that the failure to furnish sufficient number of medical officers cost the country more good men than did the charge of any rebel brigade." The official medical report in the fall, however, would state that of the more than 14,000 Union wounded, not 1 was left on the field on the morning of July 4th. Yet Dr. Letterman was sufficiently aware of the disaster to order the improvement of the system of medical supplies and ambulances. As for Dr. Maccabee, not long after he sent in his protest, an accident would take his life. The Confederate Army might have done even worse. Not only did it have to prepare for another possible battle and also keep medical personnel and ambulances in reserve for those who became ill on the retreat, it did not have sufficient transportation back to Virginia for movable casualties. Lee's medical director, Lafayette Guild, ordered left behind abundant supplies for the wounded and the sick. But that could not be done. In the disaster that followed, the Confederate government and army would take even less note than did the Union side. Nothing would be said about its helpless soldiers drowning by a flooding creek, or left lying unattended for days. One of the Gettysburg papers claimed that the rebels left behind them 6 drunken, inefficient, and worthless surgeons and 11,000 wounded. Another local paper bemoaned this inhumanity and poltroonery. But the Sanitary Commission's report described the Confederate doctors as intelligent and attentive, even as it accepted the Army's explanation that impending battle required the removal of most of its surgeons. In short, no neglect was admitted, though Meade took with him more than 4 out of 5 of his doctors. Christian Commission delegates digging graves for the dead reported more boldly, but with masterful understatement, that the Army of the Potomac did not leave a sufficient force to bury the dead, much less to afford necessary attendance upon the mangled and bleeding forms. Union and Confederate, they lie side by side, many without even a straw under them, some with a rail or bottle under their head, half-clothed, destitute and suffering, many carried fresh from the amputating table. Washington was oblivious. President Lincoln had no idea about what was going on in Gettysburg. His wife Mary had suffered a terrible injury in an accident on the second day of the battle and seemed in danger. She had jumped out of a runaway carriage and received a head wound that grew infected. The private distress of the president was compounded by the inability of Meade to finish off Lee's army. While the rest of the country celebrated a victory at Gettysburg, Lincoln's eyes focused on the retreating Confederate army, hoping to see it annihilated. He thought that defeat of the fleeing Confederates might end the war. The Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, appeared equally oblivious. He, too, looked to the upcoming days of hoped-for battle. Subordinates who were supposed to handle medical problems didn't understand either. When Nurse Harris of the Ladies' Aid Society went to the War Department on July 3rd to beg permission to bring supplies to Gettysburg, besought the privilege with tears, her pleas were flatly rebuffed. She went anyway. "The Lord will carry me there safely," and only regretted that she obeyed orders about provisions. Nor did the Surgeon General, William A. Hammond, recognize the magnitude of the emergency in Gettysburg. At first he even refused the offer of civilian help. "How many volunteer surgeons may I send?" Pennsylvania Governor Andrew Curtin asked, and was told none. "The medical director of the Army of the Potomac has plenty of surgical aid." General Robert C. Schenck, in command in Baltimore, in turn complained that barns, houses, and yards are full of the wounded. Pennsylvania is not taking care of them. Eliza Farnham's call for help was published in Philadelphia, but the press remained mostly silent about the horrors. "The Army has left Gettysburg," Nurse Farnham wrote, "and we are not here an hour early for the suffering. Please send all that you can." On July 9th, Nurse Harris wrote home about wounded men drowning in flash floods and thousands who were still naked and starving. "God pity us! God pity us!" As disaster engulfed Gettysburg, the Philadelphia Inquirer boasted that "our wounded left in Gettysburg are well cared for." But visitors saw, as a woman from Maine wrote, that the newspaper accounts were very different from reality. Men didn't talk much about what was happening all around them. Men need to be strong, need to be men. If you are a wounded, dying soldier in great pain, you try to suppress your cries. Die like a man. If you are a caretaker, you don't often write letters telling about the horror. If you write official reports, you stress the positive. When civilian doctors finally started helping, the medical inspector of the Army would find in late July that the hard work of the citizen surgeons, just like that of the Army doctors, had been performed with fidelity and ability. By October, however, with the emergency past, Dr. Letterman's final report would blame many, except himself, and revert to the standard Army line, citing the judgment of the head of the General Hospital, which was organized by the end of July to take care of all the patients, that the civilian doctors were of little use. Reverend Henry Bellows, head of the Sanitary Commission, had to work with the government, and so he was charitable, writing to Hammond that the task at hand could not be done by anything short of archangels in prescience and resources. There was some truth to that. To his own people, asking for help, he admitted that no energy you can use can equal the demand here. Telling the world how badly the system failed was not likely to encourage donations now or in the future. Mrs. Farnham would stand no more than 4 days at the battlefield. Others left quickly, too. Most stayed. Those first days were the worst. A friend would later note how the constant feeling of inability to give adequate relief devastated Farnham. She wrote of a man and his son lying beside him, each having lost a leg, other men with both legs gone. But the most horrible thing was to see these limbs lying piled up like offal. She left Gettysburg, her friend would testify, and never recovered. For a long time after, she could not sleep. She died 6 months later. Her friend objected indignantly to the death being ascribed to consumption. The cause, but a simple loss of vitality. Doctors worked day and night. "I never saw men work harder and complain less," an Army medical inspector would report. Day and night. Decide who should be looked at first. Leave hopeless cases alone. Lift a body onto the makeshift operating table. Try to stop the soldiers thrashing and howling. Administer anesthesia. Be careful about the right dosage. A nurse would write to her mother, "I saw a man die in half a minute from the effects of chloroform. It seemed almost like deliberate murder." Amputation followed amputation. There was no end to the wounded. Piles of limbs were stacked on the ground under one tree. Surgeons had to be held up while continuing to operate. They fainted from exhaustion. One doctor recorded in his diary getting up at 2 a.m. and working incessantly until midnight. Anxiety is constant. The strain upon both.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?